Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dorinda Reyna, your moderator for today's webinar, ThreadFix 2.4, Maximizing the Impact of Your Application Security Resources. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter via the chat feature. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect those and address those at the Q&A session at the end. I would now like to introduce Dan Cornell, a globally recognized application security expert who holds over 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at Denim Group, he leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process. Dan Cornell?
Thanks, Dorinda. Welcome, everyone. Happy folks could join us today. Today we're going to talk about the upcoming 2.4 release of ThreadFix, and as the title of the webinar indicates, a big focus of the development we've been putting into ThreadFix, certainly over the last couple of releases, but especially in the 2.3 to 2.4 release, has been looking at ways that organizations can maximize the impact of the security resources they have. So that should be a consistent theme throughout. Every application security team we encounter has the same problem. They have a huge number of applications to keep track of. They have a tremendous amount of work, of testing work, of triage work to do, and they don't have enough staff. And so what we want to do for ThreadFix users is to make sure that they can get the maximum value of the investment that they're making in application security. So again, that'll be a thread that we'll see as we talk about the upcoming capabilities in the new version of ThreadFix. I want to start out, agenda-wise, just to provide a quick overview of ThreadFix. We won't go through a full demo of a use case of ThreadFix. Hopefully folks on the call have some experience with ThreadFix. If you don't, we'll put links to some resources, some introductory resources to ThreadFix and how it works for folks to review later on. We're going to spend the bulk of the time looking at the major updates that have gone into the 2.4 release, and then we'll have time for questions. And as Dorinda said, please please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A, and we'll take some time to respond to those at the end. So what ThreadFix lets organizations do is first create a consolidated view of all of their applications and the vulnerabilities that have been identified in those applications. And so you can lay out your application portfolio, attach metadata to the applications so that you know which ones are subject to PCI, which ones are external facing, which ones potentially are written in Java. You have that consolidated view of your application portfolio, and then you can load in the results of all the different testing that you do. If you're doing static testing, dynamic testing, if you're doing testing with IAST, if you're doing manual penetration testing, if you have third-party security reviews, the results of all of these activities can be loaded into one central location. ThreadFix cleans up that data and presents you with a unified view. Once you have all of that data in one central location, you can start to prioritize application risk decisions based on that data. So you can look across your portfolio very broadly at the issues that have been identified. You can also drill in very specifically to get different views of data. And that lets you make decisions about which vulnerabilities need to be fixed first, which vulnerabilities maybe you can defer, and which vulnerabilities, let's be honest, you may never get around to fixing. But it lets you look at this in a data-driven way so that you can make risk-based decisions on how you're going to spend your limited remediation resources. And finally, and I think this is really important, ThreadFix lets you translate vulnerabilities over to developers in the tools that they're already using. Communicating with developers by emailing them or printing out PDFs is a horrible way to deal with developers. Developers don't speak PDF. Manually correlating vulnerabilities in an Excel spreadsheet, also a horrible misuse of a security team's time to provide that unified view of vulnerabilities. And it's a horrible way to communicate with developers. And so ThreadFix lets you take this vulnerability data that security teams care about and package it up into software defects or software change requests and to put it into the defect tracking systems that the development teams are already using. This takes the friction out of the process of resolving these vulnerabilities. You want to make it as easy as possible for developers to do what you want them to do, which is fix vulnerabilities. And so that's a big theme with us for ThreadFix. How do we save time for the security teams, and how do we reduce friction for development teams? just to get an idea of how this works, again, you load in the results of all the static testing, dynamic testing, interactive testing. The results of all those scanner tools get loaded in and live alongside the results of your manual assessments, your third-party reviews, and all of the false positive review that you're doing. That gives you a single consistent data set for each application in your portfolio and across the applications in your portfolio. From that, you can do reporting and analytics. You can start to answer a much more sophisticated set of questions about your application security program, how it's performing, what decisions you could make in the future. And it lets you package this data up to ship it to defect trackers, to developer IDEs, and also to characterize it up in the organization into GRC systems. What we want to do with ThreadFix is let the folks running your application security program be able to manage all of their data very efficiently, and then to translate that data as appropriate out to different stakeholders. Looking at what we've done with the 2.4 release of ThreadFix, there are a number of different areas that we've worked on. We've tried to make the vulnerability triage process much more efficient, much more intuitive. We've tried to make it much more flexible in how you manage vulnerabilities, to give you different options when managing vulnerabilities. As always with ThreadFix, we are constantly including integrations with new products, new services, and so we've done some more of that with the 2.4 release. And we've also added some administrative updates to allow you to better audit and track users, as well as to do enterprise authentication with SAML. And we'll talk more about this at the end. This is something I'm pretty excited about. We've also developed some really interesting technology that can help you identify code reuse within your organization, and specifically code reuse within your organization that is resulting in vulnerabilities in applications spreading throughout your enterprise. And we're really excited because this technology lets you look across all of the testing you've done in your portfolio and to identify potential opportunities to fix single vulnerabilities and translate those vulnerabilities downstream so that you get a force multiplier effect of fixing these vulnerabilities. And so similar to the types of things that a dependency check or a Sonatype is doing, identifying component use, known components that are being used that have known vulnerabilities, this lets you identify internal component reuse within your organization and how that can potentially be causing vulnerabilities to spread throughout your organization. So first we'll look at vulnerability triage, and one of the things that we hear over and over with ThreadFix, or a request is, can you, if I load this data into ThreadFix, will it automatically mark false positives for me? And I wish it did. I really wish that it did, but the unfortunate state of affairs is that we typically have to trust what the scanner has identified, and obviously if you have triaged a vulnerability from Fortify and an Audit Workbench or something, we can import that. So what we've tried to do in 2.4 is to make that triage process more efficient, to allow your analysts to triage more vulnerabilities faster so that they can get focused on getting those vulnerabilities actually resolved. The first way we've done this is through the user interface. You can, it now saves the view state that you had. So it saves your vulnerability display status, it saves your filter state. So as you navigate through the application and as you, dive into vulnerabilities and back out, this state is maintained over time. This makes it a lot easier and more intuitive to navigate the application and to zero in and to focus in on the vulnerabilities that you're most concerned about. See what that looks like. Again, it's hard to, in a screenshot, to show what the saved state looks like, but as you navigate away from this page and navigate back, the decisions that you've made for filtering and for drilling down in the data state. We've also increased and made more flexible the way that you can do vulnerability pivots. The previous view into vulnerability data in ThreadFix basically grouped first by criticality, critical, high, medium, and low, and then drilled in by CWE. Now you can set primary and secondary vulnerability pivots, and so this lets you get the view you want into the data. You're not required to look at it, again, from your criticality first and then CWE second. Instead, you're allowed to do things such as reorganize to say, well, I want to look at the type of the vulnerability first, and then under that, show me the critical ones. And so if you are, for example, spending time really trying to eradicate SQL injection in your organization, this allows you to focus in first on SQL injection and then on the ones that you consider to be the most serious. You can also drill in under, under other ways. You can look at what the different scanners have for their rules and see how different scanners are identifying the same classes of vulnerabilities, so that you can look and see, for SQL injection, how does Fortify find this, how does Checkmarks find this, whatever that might be. And so we've provided a lot more flexibility in the way that you drill into the data so that you can focus in on the vulnerabilities that matter most first. We've also given you the ability to track points in time for specific applications so that you can say, we released this application at this point in time, and so now you know which vulnerabilities existed in that particular version of the application, and you can use that to understand on trending graph the progress that you've made over time. And it also lets you, when you look at particular vulnerabilities, go back and see which versions of the software those vulnerabilities existed in. This allows you for better progress tracking over time, and that's an important thing as you communicate up. It's important to be able to characterize the progress you've made in your program so that you can show the impact of the new testing methods that you've used, the impact of the remediation, impact of training. You can show how your software, hopefully, is getting better over time because of the efforts of your application security program. So as you see, that lets you go in, mark certain points in time, and you can understand what vulnerabilities existed when, as well as when you look at the vulnerabilities, you can see for this particular vulnerability, which versions of the software did it exist in. We've also greatly improved the way that we display source code inside of ThreadFix. Candidly, this used to be really, really bad and not intuitive. It wasn't, certainly wasn't the best part of the application. Now, we've made it better. And this allows for a lot faster and more intuitive vulnerability triage. Now, we still support doing vulnerability triage in, for example, like a Fortify audit workbench or in the Checkmarks console, and now those decisions you've made from a triage standpoint flow into ThreadFix, but we're also trying to make it easier for organizations who want to do that type of triage centrally inside of ThreadFix. We want to make that a lot more convenient as well. So that's why we've spent some time essentially prettying up the source code display and making it easier for security analysts to look through vulnerabilities that have been imported in ThreadFix and not have to use a second tool. Again, a lot of organizations have great workflows built up around how they handle, we generate results, we triage them over here, they move over here. We'll still support those, but for organizations that want to do all of this triage from one central console, we're trying to make that as efficient and as clean as possible. We've also tried to make it much more flexible in ThreadFix how you can manage vulnerabilities. And the two things that we've done, or two major things that we've done for this release, is to allow for the creation of defect defaults, and this is an improvement on some of the work that we did in 2.3, as well as to allow you to attach multiple defect trackers to applications. And we'll talk through some of the use cases we've seen people use or need this type of flexibility for. The first is allowing you to essentially set up templates for what you want defects to look like. This code was originally contributed by the Samsung Arctic folks, and we want to say thank you very much to Oleg, Sanjay, and their team. They did great stuff. This is a fantastic user-contributed capability. It was originally available in the ThreadFix 2.3 release. We've made some improvements on top of that. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to set up templates and defaults for when you're creating defects inside of ThreadFix. This makes creating vulnerabilities much faster and much more standardized so that you can more quickly go through, group things together and say, just create the defect based on this. It fills the default, the text, fills in the appropriate values and converts that over to, sends it to Jira or to, Bugzilla, whatever system that you're using. And the real value of that is that it lets you standardize the way that all of these defects look, that your security analysts can create very quickly. That makes them easier for developers to understand when they get there. And again, what we want to do is reduce the friction associated in dealing with development teams. We want to take wherever possible, we want to take friction out of the process and make it easy for developers to receive these reports. And if you can standardize the way that all of your security defects are submitted, that makes it easier for the developers to know this is the type of defect I need to fix, this is where those defects are located in code, these are the resources I need in order to determine how the fixes should look. Again, we want to take whatever friction we can out of the process. And the defect defaults, again, contributed by the folks from Samsung, really, really appreciate their work. And that's a great example of us getting feedback on the user experience in ThreadFix and finding those features that we can add that are going to make folks much more efficient in the way that they chew through this data. We also now, and here we can see where you can set up these various defaults. You can create templates. What's the issue type? You can fill in various fields in the title and the summary. You can default to project. All these decisions that you might have had to make before for each and every defect that you created, you can now set these defaults so that you just select the bugs or select the vulnerabilities that you want. They appear in a templated bug much, much quicker than before. We also now allow you to attach multiple defect trackers. We've always been very flexible in the way that we let you lay out the various defect trackers that exist in your organization and how each project is connected to those different defect trackers. But one of the things that we found is organizations in certain cases had multiple defect trackers or multiple tracking systems that were associated with vulnerabilities that were found in specific applications. A very common pattern for this, there may be one system, let's say that an organization is using JIRA to track the coder responsibilities for fixing application vulnerabilities, but they have another system, a Bugzilla or some other IT change management system that's required to track infrastructure or configuration changes. Before, ThreadFix would support, again, probably handling the bulk of those results or bulk of those vulnerabilities that would be sent off to JIRA, but there wasn't a built-in way to also send those configuration vulnerabilities to the system that they needed to be sent to. So this allows for a much more flexible handling of vulnerabilities and allows you to mold or customize ThreadFix to work more specifically in your environment and in the workflows that you have built up inside of your application security program to deal with these types of issues. So we can see here we can set up multiple defect trackers. We've got a Bugzilla instance in this case. Maybe that's being used to track configuration changes. We've got a JIRA system that's being used to track the code changes. Then you can, when you go to create defects, when you rubber band certain vulnerabilities, you can decide where do I want to send these vulnerabilities. Do I want to send these configuration vulnerabilities, dealing with the bad use of HTTPS? We're going to send those over to the Bugzilla system that the IT operations group is using. And we're going to take these other vulnerabilities, these code-related vulnerabilities, and we're going to send those over to the JIRA system that is used by the development team. Again, this goes back to the theme we've talked about before, which is when you load all this data into ThreadFix, how do we make it really easy to present it to other stakeholders in your organization in the tools they're already using so that they don't have to learn a new system. You don't have to change your workflow. You just speed up your workflow by having the support of this automation. Here we can see that we've got defects found by different tools, but also sent off to these different defect trackers with their status updates being tracked separately. As I said, we also, with ThreadFix, are always integrating with new systems. As new vendors come on the market, as new tools become available, we are always looking to connect with the all the different types of systems that organizations are using. And we recognize that making it easy to onboard these systems is also something very important. One of the first changes we made, Checkmarx has extended their API. They now have a REST API in addition to the legacy SOAP API. And so you previously had to upload individual XML files from checkmarks into ThreadFix, and we've seen some tooling built around this. Matt Tesoro at Pearson has built some great utilities in support of that. But you really, where possible with ThreadFix, don't want to just be dealing in individual files. You want to be able to connect to a system and to pull in all the relevant data. And so now by being able to treat checkmarks servers as remote providers, that allows for a much more efficient integration with checkmarks. We also now have support for the on-premise contrast installations. We've supported the cloud-based contrast IaaS for a while, and now we have support for their on-premise enterprise contrast implementation. And again, this just allows for support of more contrast implementations. That's one of the things that we saw with our client organizations. A number of them were looking at contrast, have adopted contrast. A portion of those had adopted contrast as an on-premise solution, and so this this supports now make sure that they can pull in all the data from all the testing they're doing centrally inside of ThreadFix. One of the things we also noticed working with organizations, a lot of them had a tremendous amount of pre-existing testing and portfolio layout that was handled in these external providers. And so organizations that were using White Hat, that were using Veracode, they had a tremendous amount of applications that were already being tested in those systems. And from a user experience before, we required you to individually link up applications. And what ThreadFix now lets you do is to bulk create applications inside of ThreadFix based on the portfolio that you've already laid out in this remote provider. So this allows for a much faster initial ThreadFix deployment and configuration. It lets you show results with ThreadFix a lot faster than you could before by being able to look at these external systems, pull in the data en masse, and then, again, over time, ThreadFix just continues to sync with those. We've also made some administration updates. We've provided a lot better visibility into user auditing, being able to see the login history, failed logins, as well as the audit, is providing you the ability to audit permissions and access that has been attached to certain users. This allows you to have better situational awareness of the user activity inside of ThreadFix and to provide a better audit trail for what folks have been doing inside of the system. We also now have support for SAML. So ThreadFix can now be used in more enterprise situations where you have those enterprise-wide authentication and authorization implementations. So again, this just allows you to take better advantage of the existing authentication and authorization infrastructure you have in your organization and to have that translate to ThreadFix. Finally, I'm excited about this just because I'm a techie, but it also really feeds into the things we've been talking about, which is how do you maximize the impact of the resources you have. As we talked about a little bit in the beginning, our vulnerability prioritization or hotspot detection helps you identify situations where you have multiple applications throughout your enterprise or multiple teams throughout your enterprise that are using shared code. So whether it's a team that you know is developing components or frameworks that are intended to be distributed throughout the organization, or whether you may have some cut and paste code reuse where code is making its way around the organization in a less formal way. ThreadFix looks across the static analysis that you're doing, so across the various applications that you're doing static analysis for, and it is identifying situations where you have code reuse. So it's looking at things like package naming, file naming, it's looking at the control or data flows inside of vulnerabilities, and it is identifying those code reuse or component reuse situations. And more importantly, it is identifying situations where you have vulnerabilities in those internal components or frameworks and where those upstream vulnerabilities are essentially infecting downstream applications. So this helps to identify situations where you can look and say, hey, if I can fix this vulnerability that this team is producing and work to get that code distributed downstream to the 20 folks that are using it, for the effort of fixing one vulnerability, I get the impact of addressing 20 of these vulnerabilities. every organization that we've worked with has a extremely limited remediation budget, which is just the unfortunate reality of the world. And so by providing this type of visibility across what different development teams are doing and identifying potentially informal code sharing arrangements, and furthermore by layering on top of that this identification of situations where vulnerabilities are being spread throughout because of this code reuse, that helps you to get the most value from a limited remediation budget. You can go to the team that is upstream and say, hey, if you guys fix this stuff, the next time the folks downstream get a release, they're going to get the benefit of that fix as well. And so similar to the work that tools like Dependency Check or organizations like Sonatype or Black Duck are doing, where they help you to identify known components that have known vulnerabilities. What our Hotspot technology is doing is helping you to identify unknown, or potentially unknown, but internally developed components. So components that are not necessarily known via Maven to the outside world, but code that exists only in your organization. It helps you identify those known vulnerabilities in these internal components. And so I think for organizations that are concerned about open source security, concerned about the leverage associated with fixing or cleaning up the use of insecure components, our Hotspot technology is a great complement to the things that those folks are doing, because this helps you look both at the public component reuse and the security impact of that. It also, with the Hotspot detection, helps you identify internal component creation and reuse and the security risks that come along because of that as well. So you can go and in the analytics, you can see which of the vulnerabilities that exist in the most places where they have the strongest signature. Let's drill in and look at those first and determine, is this a situation where we have code reuse in place? If so, who do we need to track down inside of the organization to talk to about this so that we can get this vulnerability fixed and get that fix pushed out throughout the internal teams? So we've talked, again, about the major things that we've done in 2.4, making vulnerability triage faster, more efficient, making vulnerability management more flexible to better accommodate your pre-existing workflows. We've obviously extended integrations, and we're always thrilled to do that, especially with the remote provider bulk creation of applications that really lets you take advantage of the investment that you've made in those external providers and quickly get ThreadFix up and running and up to speed with the work you've already put in. Made some administration updates, and again, as a techie, but also as a person who likes to see folks get more efficient in their processes, we're really excited about this vulnerability prioritization or Hotspot technology. And that's because, again, when you're doing this testing across your application portfolio, you should start to get some benefit of being able to analyze that data. And we're excited to have that Hotspot technology available. We've used it in a number of client environments and have really, it really provides some great visibility that we're excited to have available to more folks that are out there. Now we'll open it up for questions. Again, if you have any questions, hopefully you can ask them on the Q&A, and I can get them answered now. If you have other questions, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm just Dan at denimgroup.com or at Daniel Cornell on Twitter. And now we'll open it up to questions. All right. One second, pulling up the question console. Okay, excellent. So I've got a question in about the handling, the ability to attach to different defect trackers and support for more operations, IT operations teams. Right now, ThreadFix is very focused on application level vulnerabilities, but we are, and we do have some support for things like Nessus, as well as some of the application scanning tools identify vulnerabilities that need to be addressed by, that ultimately will be addressed by IT operations teams. And so for organizations that are importing those types of reports, that's great. One of the things that we're also doing going forward is we will be, not with 2.4, but with future versions, we'll be expanding our support for network and infrastructure vulnerabilities to allow for an even more centralized view across the enterprise into your risk exposure because of vulnerabilities, both on the application side as well as on the infrastructure side. So we're excited to be moving in that direction. Next question is a question about providing the ability to upload or to alternatives to remote connections for the remote connection tools like a Contrast and Veracode. So the direction we have been moving there is more centered around supporting the network-attached versions, supporting things as remote providers. We do have built-in, or we do currently have some support for file uploads for, obviously for check marks, because that's, how we've been interacting with check marks in the past, also for IBM AppScan Enterprise. And so from a direction standpoint, we're not focused on, the direction that we're moving is less around handling individual files and, and toward more pulling data from APIs. That said, if there are particular situations, that's something that is certainly worth talking to us about. We have pretty straightforward APIs that allow for creating kind of one-off support, and especially in situations, and then Checkmarks is a great example of this, where their XML file format for upload is either very similar to the same to the way that you pull data from their API, and so we can typically create shims if needed to say, hey, if you can give me this data that you would have gotten from the API as a file, we can basically reuse all the code from the other thing. And so if you have particular questions about that, please reach out. You can reach out to me, or submit something on the threadfix.it website, and we can look to, we kind of talk about what would be involved in that. And I understand that in certain environments, there's connectivity questions about being able to go out and connect to those external APIs. Obviously ThreadFix has proxy support, so you can connect out through proxies, but again, in certain environments we've worked in, connecting across the network is not a great option, so please reach out to us and let us know about that. So next question about continuous integration and continuous development. Actually, wait, there's one question that's really easy to answer. I had a question about will the slide deck be shared? Yes, the slides will be shared here shortly. There will also be a recording of this video available also shortly. And so for all the folks that attended, as well as the folks who may have registered but not been able to attend, we'll be making that available. And so it'll go up, it'll probably go up on the Denim Group blog. I would say probably tomorrow, just because there's some file conversion stuff that takes a little bit of time. But yeah, we'll be making the deck available. We'll be making the recording of the webinar available, and would love for folks that want to review it, or if you want to pass it on to your colleagues, obviously please feel free. Okay, we've got a question about using ThreadFix in continuous integration and continuous delivery environments. Yeah, that's something that we've been doing a lot of work on as well. And so I'll include some links to that in the notes, kind of more specific stuff. But what we're seeing, we've had the Jenkins plugin for a long time. What we're seeing is, kind of as you see the evolution of a ThreadFix implementation, starts out with a lot of manual, moving files around, then moves to more automation using the ThreadFix scan agent capabilities, as well as the API to load data in. And what we're starting to see a lot more of, and we love this, is pushing out there's certain portions of the scanning and testing responsibilities out to the edges, if you will, of the organization, or out to the development teams, where as part of their build, they're running security tools. And we've got a Jenkins plugin that helps support taking advantage of existing automation that's being done. You can use the ThreadFix API combined with its scan agent to push out and allow dev teams to self-serve different types of scanning. And as we've been working with organizations on the types of things that they have done, or some of the scaffolding or framework they have built around to use ThreadFix in this way, we're going to be looking to integrate more of those capabilities into ThreadFix going forward. So we're seeing a lot of really cool things being done with ThreadFix as a continuous integration, continuous delivery server, to allow security to be incorporated into that workflow of validating, hey, this last change that I made, this hasn't introduced unacceptable security risks and things like that. I think that's a really exciting direction. For a variety of reasons, but especially just because of the scale. If you look at how many more developers there are than app security folks, to the degree that we can get development teams to take over those responsibilities, that's only a net win for everyone. To the degree that we can get those teams set up so that they're incorporating security testing and seeing the incremental change and risk associated with these small changes in the application, that's overall just a great thing. Let's see, are there any other questions? I think that is everything we have for today. Again, I want to thank everybody for attending. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this was some valuable time for you. As I said, we're going to be making the slides and a recording of this available, as well as to have some notes on some of the questions along the way, and we will get that sent out to all of y'all. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to reach out to me, Dan at denimgroup.com. Twitter, I'm at Daniel Cornell, and we will we'll get those materials made available. You can share with your colleagues and review. Thank you all very much. Appreciate you guys attending today.